Hey everybody, happy Monday. Hope everyone had a great weekend. So, Mondays and Tuesdays are typically baking days for us bakers. So, I figured why not let you all in on how I make like a basic chocolate cake batter for what I use for sheet cakes. Today I'm going to be making 8 pounds of batter. So, I start off with room temperature butter. And for 8 pounds, I'm going to need 2 cups of butter, which is about a pound of unsalted butter. I get that in the blender with the paddle attachment. And I whisk for a few minutes, just to aerate the butter, soften it up, scrape it down, soften it up some more, and get it prepared for my white granulated sugar. Once I see that the butter has been aerated enough and it looks a little bit lighter, then I go ahead and I slowly start incorporating my granulated sugar. For this recipe, the granulated sugar comes up to about 5 cups. I get it all incorporated little by little, just to not make a sugar explosion. It happens more times than you'd believe. So as that's going, I'll go ahead and I'll start measuring out my dry ingredients. For flour, I do 4 cups of AP flour, all-purpose flour. And I use AP flour for my sheet cakes so that it's nice and sturdy and I know I can handle it. So after I measure out my 5 cups of flour, give the bowl a scrape. Make sure that the sugar and butter is getting nicely incorporated and aerated. You want that to be nice and fluffy before you start adding any other ingredients. Now I'm measuring out my baking soda, my baking powder, and my salt. For the salt, I use about 2 teaspoons. For the baking powder, I use 1 teaspoon. And for my baking soda, I use about a tablespoon and a teaspoon. I know it seems kind of weird, but it works. Get it all whisked and sifted. Make sure there's no lumps and clumps or any little pebbles or anything that could be in flour. So you always want to sift your flour. Once it's sifted, I give it another incorporated just to make sure that everything is nicely blended and it'll be blended in the batter evenly. This recipe also calls for 8 eggs, whole eggs, large. In baking, we always typically use large eggs. We don't really, refer to extra large or medium or small. We just stick with a large egg. It's baking standard. Again, you want your butter at room temperature, and typically you would like your eggs to be at room temperature. They blend, they get incorporated in the batter a lot easier that way, instead of being straight from the refrigerator. So this is the cocoa baking cocoa, and I love it. It has a really great flavor. Of course, it's unsweetened, but it bakes very nicely. So it's one of the cocoas I generally gravitate to. I incorporate a cup of that into 4 cups of hot water, not boiling, but definitely hot enough to dissolve your cocoa powder. After that's nicely incorporated in the water, I go ahead and I measure out another cup of dark cocoa powder. So I get a little bit of, I guess you would say like a medium or natural cocoa, and then I go ahead and I always incorporate some dark cocoa just for a little added flavor. It gives it a nice richness to the cake. I get it all incorporated little by little just to avoid making a huge mess. The cleaner you try to keep your station, the easier it is at the end. Also, it's good practice. All right, so my butter's been mixing at this point for a while. It's getting really nice and fluffy. What I'm looking for is for the sugar to, well, it won't dissolve, but it will start to get a little bit less grainy. Also, the butter will go from yellow to a nice pale white color once it's aerated enough. As you can see, it's nice and white and fluffy, really, really fluffy. So now we're ready to start incorporating our ingredients. Now for my chocolate cake, I love to add a bit of vanilla and a bit of almond extract. I think chocolate and almond just pairs perfectly together. So that's a little tip. Once my extracts are incorporated, by the way, I did use not only the almond extract, but I used vanilla bean paste. I didn't use vanilla extract for this recipe. I used my vanilla bean paste. I like using that one specifically for chocolate cake. Now for my eggs, I incorporated about 2 at a time, scraping down, after every couple, just to make sure that everything is getting nicely blended and nothing settling on the bottom. You don't want any lumps or anything. The slower you take to blend all your ingredients, it's not a race. You want to take your time. The more gentle you are with your batter, the easier it is for you to incorporate all your ingredients and the smoother your final product is going to be. There, I'm just showing you the 2 different types of chocolate I used. So all my eggs are incorporated. Just giving it another scrape, making sure that everything is good. And that is pretty much it. Now I'm gonna get it all nice and light and fluffy before I add in my dry ingredients along with my chocolate water mixture. As you can see, it's super light and fluffy here. Show you a little idea. Before I add in my flour, I always like to take the bowl out, give it a good scrape on the bottom to make sure that all of the egg is incorporated. Now, once I start incorporating my dry ingredients along with my wet ingredients, I like to do it in 3 or 4 sections. So I'll alternate. I'll start off with a little bit of dry flour ingredients, get that going. Then I'll go ahead and put in about 1/3 of the liquid. Get that going, scrape down periodically. Again, scrape. Make sure nothing settles on the bottom because you'll be surprised. You think everything is like nice and blended, and then once you pouring your batter into your pan, you'll see at the end, streaks of flour, streaks of yolk, and you don't want that. So again, I add in about 1/3 of the flour, then about, half of the remaining liquid. Get that going for a little while. Scrape. Telling you. Always scrape your bowl. And when I bake, I take my time. I try to. Sometimes, there are those days you have to run through it, but, you want to take your time. You want to make sure that every time you make your recipe, the way you do it, you always do it that same way, I go ahead and I add in the last of the liquid. You see that chocolate that's settled? Get that. Don't waste none of your ingredients. Ingredients are expensive. All right, so that's going. Now I'm ready for the last of my dry ingredients. And there you go. Now the flour and everything is in. Now it's just a matter of getting it incorporated. I mix my batter on a level 2. I don't put it on a level 3 because that'll be way too fast and it'll incorporate way too much air. Another reason I do a lot of scraping is because I like smooth batters. I don't like my cakes once they're baked and you slice into them, you see that they're full of air pockets. So the softer and more gentle you are with your batter, the less air you're gonna get in it, and the best, the better your final result is gonna be. Here I'm using my sheet pan. It's about 12 by 18. I like to line my pans, especially my sheet pans, with parchment paper. You just anything to help prevent your cakes from sticking. I go ahead and I take my parchment paper, I'll fold it in fourths, and then you just cut it down to size. Here I cut a little bit too small, so no worries. Just take your scraps and fill in whatever negative space you have. There's many recipes of what you can use for non-stick. Some people use shortening, some people use butter, some people use pan goop. I love that stuff. I just didn't have any at the moment, so I'm using some pan spray. I use Baker's Joy. That one I find works well compared to some other ones that are on the market. I stick with one type of pan spray if I'm going to use pan spray. Just going to give it a final stir. Make sure everything is incorporated. And then I get it poured into my cake pan. I have my oven preheated already at this point for about a half hour, 40 minutes on 350 degrees Fahrenheit. I get all of my batter poured into my pan. I fill my pans about 3/4 of the way. I like to overfill my pans just a bit. That way I get a nice tall leveled cake. These pans are great. This is by Magic Line and they bake perfect. My cakes come out great every single time. Tap, tap, tap. Just make sure there's no air bubbles. Here you can see my batter's really smooth. I don't have any air bubble problem today. But again, just smooth it out a little bit, make sure everything's even. Tap, tap, tap a few more. And then into the oven it goes. 350 for about 45, 50 minutes. 55, check it.